On April 9th, 1865, as the sun set, a historic occurrence took place in a small Virginian community, one that would determine the destiny of a country ripped apart by conflict. Once praised as a valiant leader of the Confederate Army, General Robert E. Lee was now confronted with an indisputable fact. Give up to Ulysses S. Grant, the Union general. What if I told you, however, that this surrender was more than just a simple act of submission? What if it was the result of severe personal hardships, poor military judgment, and a resolute will to maintain honor in the face of overwhelming defeat? Come along with us as we unearth the little-known tales surrounding this significant period in American history. Tales that show how humanity, pride, and honor clashed on that terrible day. But before we start, please support our community by liking and subscribing to our channel. There was a lot of desperation and unrelenting pursuit along the road to Appomattox. Both the North and the South were left scarred by unspeakable loss after the Civil War, which raged for 4 long years. The Confederacy began to disintegrate in April 1865. A major turning point was the loss of Richmond on April 3rd. It served as the Confederacy's capital, and the Southern resistance was about to fall when it was taken. In a desperate attempt to avoid Grant's advancing Union forces, Lee's army withdrew westward. For Lee's men, the situation was terrible. Their morale was falling, they were disheveled, and they were starving. Supplies were running low due to the damage caused by the hard winter. Formerly proud soldiers now went forward with empty bellies and sunken eyes. Lee maintained the conviction that more resistance was honorable and required, in spite of entreaties from his officers, particularly General James Longstreet, to think about giving up. Grant urged Lee to acknowledge the futility of their circumstances in a heartfelt letter he sent on April 7th. Grant wrote, "I see it as my responsibility to absolve myself of any further blood effusion." This telegram demonstrated Grant's strategic thinking as well as his wish to put a stop to the carnage that had taken so many lives on both sides. Lee, however, remained steadfast and insisted that before even considering capitulation, he needed to understand Grant's requirements. Lee was approached by his closest aides with increasing urgency as the days went by and Union troops drew closer. They conveyed their sincere worry for both his welfare and the safety of their guys. He was cautioned by General Longstreet that more resistance was pointless. He urged Lee to think about surrendering for the benefit of his soldiers, saying that the end was now just around the corner. Lee persisted resolutely in spite of these cautions. He felt that giving up would entail giving up the ideals of Southern independence and state sovereignty, which he had battled for. Both forces were ready for battle as April 9th broke. Lee's army had drastically reduced in size. They were shadows of the people they used to be. However, in a final attempt to keep things under control, Lee gave the order to attack Grant's stronghold at Appomattox Station. General Philip Sheridan's Union cavalry quickly cut off Lee's withdrawal and grabbed essential supplies, making this move disastrous. Thousands of Confederate soldiers were captured by Sheridan's relentless, swift, and decisive forces in a series of skirmishes that cornered Lee's army. In the midst of the fighting chaos, Lee had to make the painful decision to either negotiate terms for surrender or continue fighting against overwhelming odds. As he considered the future of the South and the fate of his soldiers, the weight of his choice weighed heavily on him. Grant's soldiers started to believe victory was within their reach as they pressed furiously toward Appomattox Courthouse. According to what Grant later wrote in his memoirs, Union forces marched quickly and without stumbling. They advanced resolutely, prepared to put an end to the bloody fighting that had lasted for 4 long years. Wilmer McLean's house in Appomattox Courthouse, which would come to represent the end of the Civil War, was the site of the momentous meeting between Grant and Lee. The two generals stood out from one another as they walked into the room. Lee shining in his Confederate gray suit with a beautifully carved sword, and Grant in his mud-stained clothing. This was a historical and emotional moment that involved more than just military strategy. In order to establish mutual respect despite their antagonistic roles, Grant started by reminiscing about their prior encounter during the Mexican-American War. As young cops, the two men had previously met. They were now on opposing sides of one of the bloodiest wars in history. Grant showed unexpected generosity when they talked about the terms of surrender, letting the Confederate officers keep their horses and sidearms. This action demonstrated Grant's realization that compassion, not humiliation, would be necessary for recovery. He understood that after years of fighting for what they thought was right, many Confederate troops were just attempting to go home. After signing the conditions of capitulation and getting ready to leave McLean's house, Lee stopped on the porch and looked out over the defeated army. A leader struggling with loss and accountability for his men's futures made for a moving moment. As Lee rode off to deliver the news of surrender, Union officers stood respectfully, and observers took note of the solemn situation. This surrender's emotional toll went beyond its military failure. It struck a profound chord with both armies. When the news was announced, soldiers on both sides applauded and sobbed in recognition of their shared sacrifice and suffering over the course of 4 grueling years of fighting. Lee's departure from McLean's home signified both a physical and an emotional separation. Along with his leadership, he also left behind the lifestyle that had long characterized him. Many people experienced a deep feeling of loss as he rode away from Appomattox courthouse, not only for their cause, but also for their leader who had motivated them over innumerable conflicts. The end of hostilities was not the only consequence of Lee's surrender at Appomattox. The end of hostilities was only one aspect of the surrender at Appomattox. It established a standard for peacemaking in a war-torn country. Even though many people hail this as the final end of the Civil War, it is important to acknowledge its complexity and the individual hardships of leaders like Lee, who had to overcome overwhelming odds and make painful choices in the name of honor. In hindsight, history frequently ignores these human aspects, the psychological struggles that both soldiers and commanders went through at this crucial juncture in American history. Appomattox's legacy serves as a reminder that there is always room for growth and reconciliation, even in the face of loss. Both the North and the South experienced a flood of emotion in the days after Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. Many Southerners who had bravely served under Lee's leadership experienced both relief and sadness, desperation about what lay ahead, a divided country now having to reconstruct itself, but relief that the fighting had stopped. Word of Grant's win at Appomattox swiftly spread around Washington, D.C. Instead than seeking revenge, President Abraham Lincoln saw this as a chance for healing. News of Grant's victory at Appomattox swiftly circulated around Washington, D.C., and President Abraham Lincoln saw this as a chance for healing rather for retaliation. Relief that fighting had ended, but dread over what lied ahead, a divided nation now faced with reconstructing itself. He famously said that people should act toward those who have battled against them with no hatred. Not everyone, though, felt the same way. As a result of divergent opinions on the best way to bring a divided country back together, certain congressional factions called for severe punishments for former Confederates, while others supported forbearance. Following Lee's surrender, Reconstruction got off in earnest, raising concerns about how to reconcile the grievances of Southern whites who felt disenfranchised after losing their way of life with the assimilation of millions of freed slaves into society. History books frequently fail to acknowledge how very personal this surrender was for the two participating generals. For Robert E. Lee, it symbolized both his personal and military failure. A man who had spent his entire life standing up for what he thought was right now was helpless in the face of overwhelming opposition. An important factor in this process was Lee's pride. When so many people around him urged him to put down his weapons sooner than he did, he found it difficult to accept defeat. There was more to his hesitancy than military strategy. It originated from a deeply rooted concept of honor that was strongly linked to Southern identity during the conflict. Ulysses S. Grant, on the other hand, tackled this situation with realism influenced by years of battling with troops who had endured great suffering during past conflicts. He has personal experience with the consequences of ongoing conflict for both parties. The gathering at McLean's house became significant, signifying not just the conclusion of the conflict, but also the way two enemies could unite in the face of extreme adversity despite their ideologically based disagreements. Both generals later reflected on this encounter, and Grant remarked on how physically different they looked. One was well-dressed, the other was wearing travel-stained clothing. However, they both had a mutual respect that had been developed during 4 exhausting years of carnage and innumerable conflicts. In addition to highlighting their individual experiences, this striking difference acted as a reminder of humanity in times of conflict. How during wartime challenges, even people on opposing sides can find common ground when faced with tough decisions that impact countless lives around them every day. On that fateful day at Appomattox, the sounds of gunfire subsided into quiet as the dust fell. However, the effects of Lee's capitulation would last for many decades. It wasn't merely a military loss. It was a significant turning point for a country that was struggling with its identity. Once admired as a representation of Southern pride, General Lee now served as a reminder of the difficulties in upholding honor and making sacrifices. However, what actually happened during those last few minutes of negotiations? When Lee addressed his soldiers and realized he would have to break the news of their surrender, what thoughts went through his head? And what did Grant, a commander who had put up such a fierce fight against him, think of this momentous occasion? The Appomattox surrender was not merely a conclusion. It marked the start of a protracted and difficult road toward reconciliation, one that was full with obstacles as well as aspirations for a unified country. We must consider how we might honor the teachings from the past as we consider this significant occasion. What does it mean to accept defeat with honor? How can we use these teachings in our daily life now?